Jason, the first thought I had this morning before we started recording was I guarantee you 10 years ago, if you go back and look when we both were running around Brocade with our hair on fire, neither one of us thought we were going to be sitting here with a microphone in front of us with somebody hitting record.
I agree.
Yeah. Thanks for coming in, man. I appreciate it. It's good to have you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So do me a favor. I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you're going to do a way better job of it than I am.
Sure. My name is Jason Biniewski. I work with Ruckus Professional Services. I'm more of an ICX or wired networking focused type of guy. We have a lot of guys that are, wireless design people as well as our wireless field engineers. I'm more of the ICX guy. So, I started with Brocade. 2012. I started in TAC when I was, had my CCNA ready to go, thought I knew everything, go into TAC the first day, and you're like, this is hard. But the thing I loved about TAC was that I learned so much there. I learned so much about networking. I can still remember my first big network down case that P1 comes in and you're like, what? Where do I start with this? And, of course it was a spanning tree related thing. So we got that sorted out and that sort of thing. And we got really good at troubleshooting spanning tree. But one thing with when you work in TAC is that you learn very deeply the products you're working on. And, even like the hardware level things, like different commands that, as a customer, you never go in and look at that stuff. But, you learn that, but you also learn a lot about networking too. So coming in as a pretty green network engineer, that's like that first year, lab all the time. You learn a ton of stuff. So eventually I transitioned from level 2 to level 3 TAC. And after that, I did TAC for about 3 or 4 years. And after that, I was like, okay, this break fix is fun. But I've kind of learned a great deal here. Now let's go into more of like a network design sort of thing. So that's when I joined with professional services. It was around 2016 that I did that. And I've been with the team since then. So
awesome. Yeah.
I wanted to do a little bit more travel and on-site work rather than, sitting in front of a, just at a desk on the phone all day. So, yeah.
I feel like that's the natural progression of network engineering, right? You go in, you get your first cert, you think you know everything, you learn in the first week how much you don't know. You go through the pain of that, and then you kind of go through, even in an operations role, you go through the break fix of it, and then you'd start to migrate into the design aspects of it. It's, for somebody looking at the industry thinking, I'm really interested in this, want to get into it, that's a really good progression path to take because it gets you everything from the ground up. And it's a very humbling experience, which I sit down and talk to some very brilliant people like yourself, and you realize that the years and years and years of experience all kind of have the same message behind it. And that's, you go through this progression, you take your bumps, you learn what you know and what you don't know in a hurry. And it's humbling, and it's also good. So,
yeah,
looking at how, when you're in this really green environment and you're trying to get your feet under you, do you remember your first major P1 where it was like a huge panic and network down, everything's on fire?
Yeah, of course. They're always huge panics when I come in as P1. But it's kind of funny that P1s are sometimes a little bit easier than some of the other things because you go in and you figure out what the issue is. And a lot of the time it's maybe, like a spanning tree issue or, a routing loop or, somebody misconfigured something. Or another engineer misconfigured something and the other guy calls and then, what happened? And then you go look at the logs, you're like, oh, Bob logged in and did something here. What did he do? Oh, let's go ask Bob. It's like you get those type of things. Sometimes those P3s come in and it's like, you really got to go and lab it and figure out, okay, what is the problem here? They can't deploy this thing because, either they configured it wrong or they, hit a software issue with bug or whatever. And, you got to go recreate those. So those ones oftentimes take longer than a P1 that comes in. So, yeah, my first P1, I remember I think it was a university somewhere. I can't remember where. And somebody had plugged in a phone or a hub or something somewhere and created a layer 2 loop somewhere, brought the whole thing down because it was one big flat network. So, you run into those, you don't really think about that's out in the real world, but it is where people run these giant layer 2 networks. And it's like, it's all those books tell you about that and how it's bad to do that, and then you go and see it. So it's like, okay,
yeah, oh, yeah,
it actually exists.
Yep.
So
you know what, I love to tell people now, you're spoiled because you've learned off of the pain that we went through where we didn't have tools to prevent that for a long time, you know, and so there was development that went into the software and the protocols that allowed you to basically kill those ports if that popped up. And
yeah,
I'll tell you a funny story. I might have told this on a podcast before, but I remember my first P1 clearly because I worked for an ISP. I was young. It was like one of the first ISP jobs I had. And we had our monitoring system used a dial-up modem, but it was also attached via Ethernet. So it monitored everything, but if something failed, it would do a dial-out and page you. Well, I knew for a fact that these guys, their whole thing was as soon as you went on call, somebody go in and unplug the Ethernet cable. So it pages you 1,000 times telling you everything's broken. So I go in there, and sure enough, my pager goes crazy on my first or second day on call. I go in there, and the first thing I do is look in the back to plug the Ethernet cable back in, and it's plugged in. I was like, oh, no. So somebody was digging fence post holes somewhere and went right through a piece of fiber and pretty much took out the entire state. So that was my first one, which those are the easy ones, right? You just kind of call the telco and say, let me know when you get it fixed, I guess.
Yeah.
So too funny. So
That's exciting.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. The funniest part was they didn't have an OTDR in the state, so they didn't have a way to test from fiber hut to fiber hut. So they had to drive one up from a neighboring state to get it there. It was pretty comical, but you know. So when you got into this, I guess you can take a step back at a certain point in your career and think, which one was more fun? Even though you're equipped for both, do you enjoy the design aspect of it more so than the break fix of it? Is there one you like more than the other?
Yeah, I think about that all the time. When I was in tech, like I said, you're always busy. You're always labbing. You're always, finding new issues. You're always in networking every day. And now it's like, okay, now I have time to actually sit back and, go work on some scripting or go and, I don't know, like, what am I trying to go learn a new product, something like that. And in tech, you always have your caseload and you're always on that call. So sometimes you don't have the luxury of taking a step back and learning something new, but it also is exciting and you do learn a lot in tech. I just reached that plateau where I was like, okay, I'm not really learning more, and I wanted more, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. So that's kind of how it progressed for me.
You know what? I had that same conversation yesterday. There's a massive difference between pain and discomfort. And I think sometimes professionally you have to make yourself uncomfortable because that shows that you're growing, right? I mean, it's no different than if you go to the gym and you're working out. If it's uncomfortable, that's a good thing. If it's painful, you should probably stop. So, it's very simple, but it's good. And there's, it's good to have that kind of foresight on it. But then you look at being in a role you're in, which is, to me, it's a really special role because TAC, you walk into work one day, you don't know what kind of case load you're going to get hit with, right? But then when you look at it from a professional services standpoint, the problems tend to exponentially grow, right? And so you have to have this mentality that you can't boil the ocean, number one, but the problems become much larger. And so how do you kind of wrap your head around that? Because one thing I know, the engagements are a little bit longer. So when you have a support case come in, it's usually resolve the issue, either fix it, provide a workaround, work that thing to closure, and then it's gone. But with PS engagements, it's bigger than that. So I think it's really important for people to understand how much value is behind a PS engagement that they might not have full awareness of.
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing in the experts on the products that you've just purchased. So a big one that we do in our group are large public venues. And I know you had a chat with Dwayne maybe a month or two ago, and that's kind of the bread and butter. But those are also very visible and very important to get right. So, we want the best designs for that. We want our field guys to come in and certify that everything's installed properly, as far as the wireless goes. And then on the wired, on the back end, you have the same thing. We want to make sure that it's been set up correctly in the beginning so we don't run into layer 2 issues or something strange down the road. So, I mean, you want those experts to come in and design that for you. So that's kind of like one of the the big things that we bring to the table. And it's not just large public venues anymore. We have like smart cities, and we also have like large customers as well, like, you know, big corporate customers that we come in and help out. If it's just an office that we've refreshed with, you know, new access points and new switching, we do that. We also do smaller engagements, like you just need some help, you know, installing or building a network design for a, you know, MDU or a hotel or something like that. That's, you know, we have the experts that can do that, that type of work. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love how one of the best things about this industry is that when you go to work, you're not doing the same exact thing. You're not going to break rock every day, right? It's always different, always. And
it's always changing too. So.
Yep. Yeah, so that kind of leads me to my next point. So when we look at one of the things that always comes with this is we're always looking for tools to make our lives easier. And so there's many, many, many of them. And we've done live streams and podcasts and kind of touched on this in the past, and I've talked to Marcelo and Baroth about this, you know, in terms of APIs and things like that. But the ability to have a tool set that makes your life easier is paramount. But understanding that there's differences with each tool and they do different things buys you even that much more. So in your daily walk of life, you know, what tools are you seeing and looking at and playing with that you're seeing really good value and success with?
Yeah, so there's kind of a progression to it, I'd say. So, you know, coming out of TAC, it was very CLI oriented. We had some tools too, but it wasn't it was more like, let's fix this problem that's happening. It wasn't really like, let's deploy a bunch of new config or migrate, another vendor's config or something like that. We didn't do that there. So, but in professional services, that's what we do all the time. So I remember one of the first engagements I had where I had to automate it was, you know, we had a customer with about 10,000 switches. And a lot of it was older hardware too. Like we're talking about older foundry stuff like BESX, FCX. This was a couple of years ago now, probably like 5 years ago. And yeah, so they still had that stuff, and that stuff was kind of end of life then too. But a lot of it, for whatever reason, whoever installed it didn't enable SSH. They were using Telnet. So it was like, what? And, you know, one of our projects was, okay, we need to help this customer get everything back on SSH, get rid of this Telnet. So one of the scripts I had to write for 10,000 switches, it was, okay, go check if SSH is already enabled. If it is, move on to the next one. Or before even doing that, ping it. Make sure you can ping it, pingable. So I had to go through, write a script to do all that. And I did it all in Python. And, this is before, Ansible, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But, I started there and, I had a project to work on and it was quite big. So, jumping into scripting that way, it was scary, but it was also, very motivating because I had a job to do at the end of the day.
Yeah. So
doing that was great. And I built upon that type of like framework that I built in Python, and I turned it into, another type of configuration tool. Well, I'm sorry, before we just checked to see if Telnet was enabled or not, after we said, okay, yes, it is. Now, okay, next part of the script is go in and configure SSH, check if it works, then go back in and remove, say no Telnet enable, right? Remove Telnet from the config, and then check again and make sure it all works. So there's all types of checks and balances along the way when you build something like that. And I built it all in Python, which was kind of a manual thing. It was a great way to learn Python, but it was also kind of like, wow, this was, I wish I had something easier. So I took that type of framework though, and I was able to build also what I call the as-built tool. So we'll go into a customer and we'll install a bunch of switches. And when we're all done, we need to provide them a report of what we've just installed. And it needs to have all the VLANs that we've created, all the different hardware, as well as, serial numbers for all the hardware, all the SFPs. They need all that information. So, working off the Python part, I went ahead and created a script to log into all the switches and basically collect all that data that we care about, and then export it as a report. And I decided to use Excel just because everyone has Excel. So plus I'm kind of like sick and twisted in that I like VBA a little bit. I
got to go. Hang up right now.
I know. But it's just a way. Everyone has Excel, right? So it's like, okay, I can dump all this information there and then hand them, an Excel document, and they have all the information if they need to search it. Pretty much everyone knows how to use it. There's no barriers there, which sometimes there is if you were to give them just a CSV file and they had to go figure out how to use it, or how to even filter on what they care about, or even just display what is more important. So being able to do that all in Excel, I can set all those up and say, okay, this thing's in red. Maybe we should go look at it. I've set a threshold for whatever it is that it's a problem, right, that I found. So just automating all that was a huge burden off our back. We had some other stuff written in Secure CRT that someone else wrote. And I was like, okay, this is okay, but we need to make this a little bit better. So, building that in Python and kind of learning off the Python knowledge from the previous big Python thing I did, that was just my way of, gaining more knowledge and just building more tools that everyone can use. So yeah. So that's kind of the progression with that. Another thing that I did was we do a lot of network migrations where we go from Cisco to Ruckus switches. And one of the things that you got to do is, in Cisco, you have the switch port mode, access switch port mode, trunk, blah, blah, blah. We all know that. On ICX, it's a little bit different. You build the VLANs at the top of the config. So after you do it manually, once you're like, okay, never again, I need to automate this somehow. So basically I built something, again, it's in Excel. You just paste in the Cisco config, you push the macro and it pumps out an ICX config for you, and you can paste that into your switch.
Oh, that's awesome.
Little things like that, you go ahead and you just find ways to make that easy. And then I've given that to the rest of the team. I've given it to customers and let them, if they have another migration to do, or they just need to convert a config or whatever, then there you go. That's a nice tool to have in your pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a hard thing to get, especially from an education perspective, is getting somebody to wrap their head around the fact that, in the Cisco world, things are process centric. Like OSPF is process driven, and we use more of what's the term I'm looking for? More of a context kind of thing. And everybody's going to call me biased, but I like the way we handle VLANs better, because I'd rather put ports in a VLAN than VLANs on ports. You know what I mean? It's just cleaner. And that's especially when I need to go figure out what's what in a hurry, then that makes it a lot easier to find.
It's all in one spot, so that's kind of cool. It's just everyone's so used to doing it the other way that sometimes when you get a customer, they're like, what do I have to do? So, it's kind of a learning opportunity for them. But yeah, I'm okay either way. We worked on VDX too. That was an old Brocade product that they did it the Cisco way. So, of course, I know Cisco from before joining, before joining TAC. So anyway, what am I trying to say? It's all, it's knowledge that we have as part of the team that if we run into Cisco or some other vendor, we can jump in and figure it out. Yeah.
So we use everything I'm doing is in a lab. So it's nice because I can break whatever I want. Nobody's going to scream at me. But we have Python scripting built that we use YAML playbooks on top of to do resets with. And it's amazing. I love it. I owe Joe Obby for the rest of his life because he actually built that and enabled it for us. However, whoever wrote YAML, I kind of want to have a conversation with in a dark alley, because just how you have to structure that file sometimes isn't exactly clear. Like, just let me use tabs or something, make it a little clearer. But are you starting to see, because I know Ansible is YAML driven as well, are you starting to see a bigger migration into some of that stuff as well, and some of the benefit behind it?
Yeah, for me, it's something I definitely want to start using. Like I said, the progression of things is, okay, I did all that stuff in Python, but it's like, how do I make this easier on myself? And just playing around in Ansible, it's like, okay, this has made that type of very kind of crafting Python. It's like, okay, well, all those things where I got to go and run a command and then verify that it took it, that's already built into Ansible. So it's a way to kind of abstract that whole part of it. And that's one powerful thing that it offers. The next thing is, okay, well, how can I automate my Ansible playbooks then? And, I know you had Marcelo on a little while ago too, and he's got some great stuff out there. There's something called Ansible AWX. That's X as an X-ray. And it's kind of like a dashboard or a platform where you can take your Ansible playbooks, and it's more of a GUI based thing. So you can, if you need to go configure something, you just select the switches you need. You can edit your playbook there in the GUI, and then tell it to go run against these switches to add your new VLAN, or add your banner. That's an easy one, or that sort of thing. Which it's very powerful. Sometimes when I go into customers, they need something a little bit more. If I just leave and I don't give them, I say, okay, yeah, Ansible's great, here it is. But if I can leave them with, say, AWX, they have this GUI, they can go and do it like right away. It's a little bit easier for them than to have them go learn that. So, that's one of the things that we want to start providing more and more, is easier ways to configure things, and using Ansible and AWX is I think is the way forward with it.
Okay, so that spurs a thought. When we look at things like Ansible and automation, that is a tool that makes your life infinitely easier, right? And it makes your day-to-day day job infinitely easier. Is this something that you're kind of pushing and introducing to customers, or is this something that customers are coming to you saying, hey, I think we have a use case for this? Which way is it going?
It's both. In some cases, they don't even know that it's out there sometimes. So there is that, like, okay, let's bring this into them. Sometimes they ask me, it's like, okay, what should we use? And I'm like, okay, here's Ansible. This is a new thing that we've got that we want you to try. We already have the playbooks written. They're built by our engineering guys. So it's all kind of like QA'd and should be good to go. It runs that way. And then it runs the other way, where the customers come to us. They say, look, we've tried this, and, we need some help with it. Or, can we have more playbooks, please? Stuff like that. So yeah, it's both ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, networks are huge, and you need stuff like that, because you're talking about 10,000 devices. How on earth are you going to go in and manually enable SSH, verify it, and then disable Telnet without locking yourself out of a single switch? You do that by hand. A, you're going to be there for a month. And B, you're probably going to end up in a padded room by the end of it, because that's a lot to take on all at once. So yeah, I get it. It's something I want to play around with more. And here's why. So we've had a lot of, and I think you and I are kind of going to dig into this a little bit too. Internally, just within education and some other folks I've been talking to, I've been talking about best practices a lot. And one of the reasons for that is support organizations have really two vested interests, in my opinion. I think one of them is they need to get information in front of customers so that they're armed with information and they can kind of solve some of their own problems, right? But they also have a vested interest in making sure that they can still provide good, solid support when it's needed. Well, best practices tend to solve a lot of that. And I think in your world, this is probably a little bit more of a challenge, but, kind of tying into that, do you walk into customer environments a lot where they have their best practices kind of set and baked in, and they really adhere to those? Or do you find yourself in a position where you're going in, and I'm sure you're going to say both to this, but do you also have to kind of sit down and show them best practices and what they really need to do to keep their phone from ringing at 2:00 in the morning?
Yeah, you're right. It is both. But, the ones that do have it, even they struggle with trying to keep it, in sync, keep their best practices, as far as port naming conventions or even switch naming conventions, VLAN, numbering, all of that. I mean, even they struggle with keeping that all straight. So, the ones that don't have it, I try my best to, let them know like the benefits of that, of, making sure you've set your spanning tree the same across all the switches. Sometimes, they get a new guy who starts installing things. He just goes and installs it. Okay, my ports are up. I'm good. It's like, well, you didn't name the switch. You didn't, do these very basic things that sometimes that sneaks through and needs to be corrected. Or it just was like in a rush and they just never went back and did it. So, months later we go back and we're like, what's this thing? So, setting those best practices from the beginning it's great. You need it. I mean, just being a mature company, having a mature network, you need to have those things. So it's very important.
Yeah, it's organic growth is the hardest thing to build best practices around because networks do grow really quick.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of limitations that comes into it, I mean, most people think you have an industry best practice design guide on any search result you put out there, right? I mean, you have layers you need to build this thing through. But the thing that gets lost is there's physical limitations, there's cabling limitations, there's issues with buildings, there's all kinds of things that come into it that you have to navigate around that stuff and still try to get it into a best practice environment. It becomes very difficult. So I personally have a lot of respect for you and what you do because you do have to navigate through that. And that can be some pretty muddy waters sometimes too, to make sure that when you walk away from that customer site, whatever is done there is done to the absolute best that it could be at that point. You know what I mean? So kudos to you and the team. I know that's a big thing.
Yeah, that's a big part of, like I was talking about, the as built, right? We got to provide that and show them and prove that we've done that. So, I mean, that's a great way of doing it. But yeah, it's very important. And now keeping that consistency a month later or even 6 months later, it's like that's sort of, staying true to your best practices, I guess you could say. That sometimes you run into those challenges. And that also works, at the layer 1 level too. It's always sad when you walk away from something that looks pretty and then, 6 months later, you got to go back for, something new, and you go look at what you've done before and it's like, oh, what happened here?
Yeah. Yep.
It's just, that's how it is sometimes. And, it's got to try your best to, at least have a guide for customers, before you leave. And, that's very powerful sometimes.
Well, I mean, how often can we sit here and talk about, you walk into a site that blows up and grows, and the network was built because there was one guy building servers in a data center, and they said, hey, you know how to put IP addresses on stuff. You need to go expand all the switches out. That's why you end up with these flat layer 2 networks that are time bombs. So here's my question. If you had to sit down and think about it, what is the most common issue I've ran into when it comes to ICX and environments that's completely preventable, right? What would you say the number one thing is that you run into?
Well, it used to be the telnet thing, leaving telnet switched on, or just like installing something and leaving it, and not really, what's it called? Not changing the default config sometimes. It's like, okay, in our newer code, we automatically turn off telnet. It's not on, thankfully. As well as, we set the SSH login. You have a default login, but now you got to go and change that default login. So it's like just getting them, getting things installed without all those defaults to have it set properly is sometimes a challenge. Depending on who you're working with, a lot of places that's not a problem at all. They're very good at making sure everything is not just thrown together. But sometimes you walk into places where that's happening. So got to educate them. You got to provide them a template. Like, here's your template. Load this on the switch before you install it. At least they'll have those basic things in there. So that's the big one for me. I think. There's little ones like not naming your VLANs or, having, you walk in and sometimes, they have a bunch of ports configured, port names, and then, some of them don't. And you're like, well, what's all that?
Yeah.
It's stuff like that, but that's like little stuff. And I'm hoping that some of this automation can prevent that in the future. Like, okay, if we give them Ansible AWX, that will kind of be built into their playbook to add a port name. They can't enable that port or put VLANs in that port without putting a port name first. So, stuff like that. I hope in the future that that stuff is easily correctable.
You know what? This is really a testament to what you guys do, because I refuse to believe that, these networks are getting built in the world and it's just blind ignorance that's going into them. I don't believe that. I believe what a lot of it is we don't have the time to sit here and go through this thing with a fine-tooth comb and build it correctly. Because when you just said something that it triggered me, and I hate to admit this, but you said it's not that big of a deal. Well, it is, because now, and I'm not arguing with you, I'm just saying to me it's a big deal because, Jason, if you're network engineer number 1 and you've built this network out and you've had to build it so large so fast that you don't have time to go back and take care of all these little things. Matt comes in as network engineer number 2. I don't know what anything is because there's best practice pieces missing where naming is missing. So having these tools that we can bring in to correct a lot of that, that starts to simplify things a lot. And one thing that I think organizations are very, very interested in is time to restore or time to resolution. So if you have an issue and if you can solve it in half the time because everything is built out correctly, named correctly, you're going to have issues no matter what. But you put all that care and feeding into it, problem solved, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to say that, oh my gosh, it's such a problem out there, but it does happen. And you're right, it's usually because they need something done quickly, or they've had some turnover and they don't have the proper person that knows networking that well. So they run into those problems, or it's been like just sitting there for so long that the best practices haven't been working, or they just haven't been, they were implemented initially, but then it just kind of blew up. That's kind of, you're right. It's more like that. And it's definitely not everybody, but there are, there's some situations that we get into. And, that's kind of also a good thing about professional services. I can come in, I can, I talked about my as-built tool, I can run tools like that to go and find those problems for you and get those resolved, right? We have that tool set to go and do that. So that sometimes we get customers that will come in and they need help cleaning up something because they had a big layoff or they had a bunch of people leave and now they've hired a bunch of new people and they just need some help. So that happens too. And, that's where we can come in and give them a hand.
Man, that's awesome. That's why we have PS organizations so that you can send the Jasons of the world out there and put the Superman cape on and get everything back to a good, solid foundation. I think it's great. Yeah. So, and I said this when I talked to Dwayne, and I'll say this for the rest of my life. If you're on the fence about trying to pull the trigger on PS engagements because you're just not sure, I don't think you fully understand the value that you're going to get from it. It's not just, oh, we got to fix this or roll this out. There's so much more that comes from it. And again, it's a biased opinion, whatever. You can blast me all you want, but it's also true because it's not just, you're not just going to show up and be like, okay, well, let's get this installed and boom, I'm out. And I'm going to ignore everything I just said during this entire podcast because, that's your problem, not mine. No, it's you get this plus more. So I think it's a huge testament to what you guys do and just the passion and drive you have behind it. So,
yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
that's true. And it's, we're not trying to come in and criticize what you've already done or anything like that. It's more of just like, you need another set of eyes. Sometimes that's all you need to come in and do that sort of thing. Or just some kind of like augmentation or offload. Maybe you don't have the people or you need for this specific site, you just need that extra help for whatever reason. It's very important for your company. So, we can come in and give you a hand with that.
Yeah. And it's
prevent your tack cases later.
Exactly. Yeah.
Way of thinking about it.
Yep. Well, and it can be touchy too. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a human element involved with this, right? So even if you go in and do a full-on network audit, you come out of that, that you're going to have to present things in a certain way because you've got a network engineer sitting there and probably their boss and possibly their boss as well, and you don't want to start flinging mud. So, having that understanding, you have empathy and compassion for what companies go through and transitions and growth. You can't just walk in and start flinging mud and be like, well, we looked at this, this, and this, and it all sucks. Well, that doesn't really help. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a fun, interesting challenge, I guess, is a good way to put it, But there's that understanding behind it too.
Yeah. We had a customer that did a pretty large migration and, in the beginning, they needed our help. And then, we got a process going. And they probably could have just been like, okay, we've done 1 or 2 with you guys, 3 with you guys. Okay, we could do the rest on ourselves. But sometimes it's like, well, no, we like that extra set of eyes. We know you guys work so well. Let's get you back in here. And, the next one that we do, we want you here till the end. So that's also very, very, I think, great that, we get that type of feedback from customers. They keep coming back. So, yeah.
The cool thing about it, and I may be repeating myself, I don't know. I've been on both sides of it. So I've been in front of a customer during a PS engagement readout, and I've been the customer, dealing with PS personnel. And I loved having that, I guess, interaction at that point, because the cool thing about it was you also you kind of have your own internal, that's a good way to put it, your own internal culture, right? So everybody, is aware of this issue that happened last week, and this project is coming up next month, and you get kind of stuck into your own little world, and then you get somebody from the outside coming in that just isn't worried about the internal politics and minutia of what's going on. They're just looking at the holistic picture of the network, and you get a whole different viewpoint on it at that point. You're like, oh man, I hadn't even thought of that. And it starts to change the landscape of everything. So then it changes your projects. It changes, what you're working on now, what you were working on yesterday. It's awesome. So just getting that different, it's like a breath of fresh air in a way. You're like, oh yeah, creative juices, it's awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
So yeah.
Cool.
Jason, I can't thank you enough for doing this. And as with everything, you have a standing invite to come back and do this anytime you want.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, once I get more into this AWX, that's like my next big goal for the next couple of months here, is to go build that out so I can give it to customers before I leave and say, here's your automation tool.
Well, and and that's awesome. We have environments too. I'm more than willing to offer up some VM resources and some equipment you can test it against. So you need that, let me know. We'll make it happen, because I'd love to see that work.
All right, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. We'll do this again soon. So take care. Hang in there, and I'm sure we'll talk soon.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Right, thanks. See you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Ruckcast. If you just found us for the first time, be sure to follow or subscribe on your platform of choice so you can be notified of future episodes. If you have ideas for future episodes or can't find Ruckcast on your favorite platform, contact us at ruckcast@comscope.com. And as always, thanks for listening.